So let's talk about Chapter 15 and the Commerce Clause, but also administrative. And I don't know why this newer book here that we're using combined these together. Past books did not. Kind of kept the two topics separate. I don't know if I like this or not, but anyhow, we'll cruise on. Try to give you guys enough time to read the comics, although it would be in the PowerPoints, I believe, that are posted if you guys take the time to look at those. So we'll go through these learning objectives, and you guys can read those. But the U.S. Constitution, so it's right in the Constitution, right? It provides the legal framework for a federal government and the authority that it has to regulate business activities. And one of those biggest ones is, in fact, the Commerce Clause of the Constitution. And it says this, right, in Article 1, Section 8, Congress shall have the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations among the several states and with the Indian tribes. Again, this is interpreted very, very broadly. Key areas, of course, are regulation, both of foreign commerce, how it comes in, how we inspect it, what's required, on and on and on, but also interstate commerce, so commerce that goes between states. There are some limitations. In other words, states are granted fairly broad powers as well, including rights to tax with some limitations. Okay, there are limits both to state police power and their right to tax, and we'll talk about those, of course. So, federal government has exclusive right to regulate foreign commerce. Right, they can embargo things, they can put on tariffs, they can do all kinds of things. Right. It says a state can regulate commerce if it occurs entirely within state boundaries. Yes and no. As long as it does not affect interstate commerce, they can regulate it. And this is, again, interpreted very, very broadly, and we'll show you that in just a minute here. But interstate commerce is commerce. It regulates commerce amongst the several states. The persons that are engaged in those activities affecting it. And here's the example of the very broad power. And this was, I think it's back in the 30s, if I'm not mistaken. Wickard versus Filburn. I don't remember which was which. I think Wickard was actually the Ohio wheat farmer. And he'd grown some wheat, but he used it entirely on his own farm. He used it as feed for critters and to grind, and use it for his own family to consume. Yeah, that was it. Okay, he didn't sell any of it. And yet in the 30s there was a heavy regulation, on farms and ranches in terms of the amount of production. If I'm not mistaken, they were trying to control and reduce the amount of production in order to increase prices and drive inflation. Wasn't the brightest economic theory at the time, but in any event, that's what they were trying to do. And Wickard was told that his production was to be regulated like everybody else's, and he said, "Wait a minute, it's not interstate commerce. I'm doing it, just on my farm, and everything's staying." So not just in the state; it was staying right on his own farm. And yet, the Supreme Court ruled against the farmer and said, no matter how small your production is, it has an effect on commodity prices, because grain, wheat's a commodity. It has an effect, and even though it might be infinitesimal, it's still an effect, and thus is subject to regulation by Congress. Who is the ultimate interpreter of the Constitution? So that comes into effect in that case in particular, but it's the Supreme Court. Let's pause there, and we'll come back and do a part 2. So.